started.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from today. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar around exploring sexuality, identity and mental health in the workplace. My name is Emma Reynolds. I'm the Head of Learning and Development at Mental Health First Aid England, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to be chairing the discussion today. We've got an incredible group of panellists who I'm going to talk about in a moment. Before I dive into what we're covering today, we are going to talk about mental health conditions and suicide in relation to sexual identity. And so what I would say is be kind to yourself, and if you need to take any time away, and if you need to step away from the discussion and come back, then please do, please prioritise your wellbeing during this discussion. So what are we going to talk about? We've got lots of things to get into. So we're going to start with setting the scene, and Mo, who's joining us today, is going to do some of that scene setting for us before we start moving into looking around statistics around LGBT plus mental health, and why stigma surrounding sexuality and how that impacts mental health. We're going to look at providing some advice and conversation starters to help people discuss issues and support the mental health of LGBT plus colleagues. And we're going to recognise and highlight the potential impacts of the pandemic on the mental health and wellbeing of the LGBT plus community. So, who is joining us today? So we've got a fantastic panel. I'm going to ask all of them to introduce themselves, tell you who they are, what they do, and what they think about this particular subject that we're talking about. So Pippa, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
So yes, my name is Pippa Dale. So first and foremost, thanks for asking me to join this panel. Always an important conversation. I work for the French bank BNP Paribas, so an enormous organisation, and so have many different identities within our workplace. I'm also the founding member of a very small network called LGBTQ Women, which is really a very small network focusing on the femme side of the LGBT community. In essence, I work in a very male-dominated industry, and I noticed that the femme side of the LGBT community were following in the footsteps of women in quite a lot of our organisations, so slightly lesser voice, less seniority, and I really wanted to see whether I could elevate the femme side of the community. So mental health is something that's very important to me, and as I'm sure the others on the panel, but thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pippa. Mo.
Hello, lovely to be here. My name's Mo Wiltshire, my pronouns are she and her, and I work with Stonewall, which is the largest LGBT organisation in the UK, second largest in the world actually, and I'm the Director of Education and Youth, so I look after our school and college work, and I work with local authorities and also our direct delivery with LGBT young people, and I also at the moment are Interim Director of Programmes, so that's our work with workplaces, which is obviously the reason that you're here today, as well as our empowerment programs and our community engagement work. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of scene setting in a moment, so you'll be hearing more about our work there, but really looking forward to the next hour.
Thank you, Mo. And Matthew.
I'm Matthew, or Matt. My pronouns are he, him and his. And I work at MediaCom, which is an agency in the advertising industry. I work specifically as a senior planner for paid social campaigns, and but I'm also a founding member of WPP Unite, which is part of our holding company. So MediaCom is part of a larger holding company group, and we formed at the end of last year, and we're still in early stages of working through work streams on how we can use our influence within the advertising industry and its effect in wider culture and society for LGBT plus issues. So I'm looking forward to be offering my insight in today's panel.
Wonderful, thank you. So before we dive into the interactive elements of today's discussion, I'm going to hand over to Mo, who's going to set the scene for us.
Right, thank you very much. So one of the things about digital webinars is that obviously you can see us, but we can't see you. So I normally would ask for a show of hands, who's aware of the work of Stonewall. I could do that now, but it would be slightly pointless. So I'm going to, if you'll excuse me, give a very short overview of our work and why I'm here today. So Stonewall, we were formed 3 decades ago around Sir Ian McKellen of Hobbit fame, kitchen table, when he got together with a group of 10 lesbians and gay men, because we weren't at that stage trans inclusive, but got together to fight a really damaging piece of legislation called Section 28, which actually prohibited conversations that were perceived to promote homosexuality, as was the language in the time, and the presentation of homosexual families as ordinary relationships. It took 15 years for that piece of legislation to be repealed, and the shadow is still very much felt today. And we've grown from that kitchen table to a UK and global facing charity that works in 4 key areas. Transforming institutions, so we work with over 800 different employers in the UK who altogether have supported about a quarter of all the UK workforce in terms of ensuring that they are LGBT inclusive in terms of the places that we work, and our schools and colleges work there. We also work to empower individuals through leadership and community and campaigning programs, changing hearts and minds, so that's producing some of the research that you'll be hearing about today, as well as ensuring we are platforming diverse LGBT voices and changing and protecting laws. Used to just be changing, and now we recognise the importance of protecting too, given some of our political environments. Now, over those 3 decades, many of us will have lived through those. There have been significant improvements in LGBT plus inclusion, but there's still a very long way to go. And as a result of that, if you like, the systemic oppression in terms of hostile legal frameworks and how they've bled through into cultural difficulties, we have higher prevalence of mental health amongst the LGBT community. But what's really important that we are all clear about is that our experiences of mental health are influenced by our identities, and having a certain identity doesn't in itself cause poor mental health. It's the impact of how we experience the world and how other people treat us that create the conditions that represent risk factors for poorer mental health outcomes. So it's the societal norms of stigma and prejudices towards LGBT plus people that create those disproportionate levels of poor mental health, which means that as a society, we can do something about it, which is a really important message for today. So some of you will be very well versed in concepts of intersectionality. For others of you, it may be a newer concept, but it's really important when we talk about identity to understand that no one is a single identity. Who we are is made up of a number of different aspects of our life. It's to do with our sexuality, it's to do with our gender identity, our class, our race, our faith, our age. All of these aspects combine in different intersections to represent who we are. And our experience of marginalisation will vary depending on which particular aspect of our identity that we're thinking about. And for some of us, we have multiple aspects of our identities that are marginalised. So, for example, the discrimination that may be felt by a white woman as a marginalised identity will be less than a woman who is also a person of colour, as well as disabled, and also a lesbian. There will be compound marginalisations that actually ensure that we need to think about the intersections of different experience of discrimination when we're exploring identity. And understanding that if we think about its societal response to those of us in minority identities that creates those risk factors for mental health, understanding some of the concepts about minority stress. And I know that our mental health first aid colleagues are going to be sending around lots of resources that include references to further study around minority stress, and actually what that means in terms of concepts of internalized shame, in terms of behaviors to support self-protection, and necessary concealment of who we are in different settings for our own protection. So I also thought it was useful to point to some of the research. This was conducted by the Queer Futures Project, which is run across a number of different universities. And again, the links will be shared in the resources. But knowing that there are lower positive mental health outcomes for LGBT people, this study asked why. And so it's a very clear piece of research in relation to 16 to 25-year-olds, looking at rates of suicide attempts. And it is clear that depending on the study that you look at, actually for LGBT young people, that the risk is 4 to 7 times higher than those who are not LGBT. And there's clear themes about what risks have created that. And it is about experiences of homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. It's about the internalized shame, if you think about that minority stress theory of being in the minority. So the prevalence of societal norms, if we think about our workplaces, what that might mean there in terms of sense of acceptance. And across, if you like, being out in different domains, perhaps being out at home but not at work, or vice versa, and some of the conflicts that introduces, and experiences of rejection that means they're unable to talk due to past experience. So less of an outlet for exploring the conversations we need to have to support positive mental health. And it's also important to bear in mind the social risk factors. Again, there's lots of research out there, but we know, and our LGBT in Britain report points to negative experiences in the workplace, the fact that being LGBT is considered a newsworthy story still in this day and age, and often aspects of our identities are referred to as debates. There are challenges in relation to healthcare accessibility for some LGBT people, and experiences of family isolation and challenges at school. So all of these aspects are, as we talked about, risk factors. It does not mean that being LGBT does mean that you will experience mental ill health. We know that, and many of us in the audience will appreciate that. But it does mean, as colleagues and as leaders in our workplace setting, it is important that we are aware of the risk factors that may be present so that we can acknowledge them in our support of positive mental health.
Thank you, Mo. So that takes us nicely into our first exercise, and this isn't going to require you to do anything on the tech. So this is for you to, if you've got a pad and paper or an excellent memory, either or, this is an opportunity for you to reflect on these statistics and think about whether they are true or false. So I'm going to read them out for you. So the first one is 1 in 3 LGBT plus people have experienced depression in the last year. Number 2, 1/4 of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and other LGBT plus employees reported hiding their sexuality at work for fear of discrimination. Number 3 is 60% of LGBT plus people are likely to have experienced poor mental health where work was a cause or a contributing factor. And number 4 is 10% of LGBT plus employees with disabilities reported being encouraged to hide their sexual orientation by work colleagues. And finally, 10% of LGBT employees have experienced verbal homophobic bullying from their colleagues in the last 5 years. So I'm just going to give you a moment to reflect on those and decide whether you believe they are true or whether they're false. Time passes very differently when you're sat not able to see anybody. So what we'll do is we'll go through to the first statistic, and we'll so 1 in 3 LGBT plus people have experienced depression in the last year. So the answer is false. More than 1 in 2, so 52% of people, of LGBT plus people have experienced depression in the last year. The next statistic, 1/4 of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and other LGBT plus employees reported hiding their sexuality at work for fear of discrimination. Again, much higher than we anticipated. It's 1/3 of people have hidden their sexuality at work. 60% of LGBT plus people are likely to have experienced poor mental health where work was a cause or a contributing factor. And again, the 60% figure is related to non-LGBT plus people, and it's actually 79% for those who are LGBT plus. So 10% of LGBT plus employees with disabilities reported being encouraged to hide their sexual orientation by work colleagues. And there's a theme. It's false. 24% reported to have been encouraged to hide their sexual orientation. And then finally, 5% of LGBT employees have experienced verbal homophobic bullying from their colleagues in the last 5 years. And again, it's higher than the stat that was reported in the question, so 15%. So I'm really interested to go to the panel. And we talk a lot about bringing your whole self to work. And I'm really interested to know your thoughts about reflecting on those statistics and on the numbers, particularly in relation to the workplace, and the idea of being able to bring your whole self to work, what your thoughts are around what we've heard. So I'm going to come first to Matthew, and I'd love to know your thoughts.
So just in general, I think it's important to foster an open work environment. I'm actually fortunate that Mediacom and a lot of the other agencies in our group do have this. But it's also important, I think, to recognise, particularly in a work context, when if it does happen to other people, how you can support. It's also it's not just about the people who are being exposed to, for example, verbal homophobic bullying from their colleagues, but also the others, and how you can be there to support them, to stand up against them in forms of allyship. And actually, for me, the first statistic, that 24%, actually shocked me a lot more than I thought it would when I first read it. So yeah, at a company like as big as mine, it is important to make sure that you do have that openness and open dialogue with people. And I think our company is kind of a good example of those that are changing attitudes to mental health just in general. So we were one of the first agency of its kind in the UK to champion mental health allyship as a scheme just in general, but also with ERGs for all areas, as Mo had shown earlier on about minority stress and intersectionality. And it's important that everything is looked into and addressed. So yeah, I think it's something that we should all be mindful of when we are experiencing it in the day-to-day. And I think right now it's probably even harder to spot sometimes, especially given that everyone, or the vast majority of people, are working remotely. So being mindful of that in any kind of context, and how the starting of that blending between work, blending more between work and personal life balance, how we should be able to support one another.
Thank you. I think you raised some really interesting points about allyship, which we'll definitely come on to moving through today's session, and the fact that things are so different in the backdrop to the pandemic, and there's probably some things for us to really think about. So thank you, Matt. Pippa, what are your thoughts?
So again, I think everybody's in agreement that the stats don't read well. And I suppose what I from my point of view, what's most interesting is I've worked for large corporations all of my career. That's covering now some decades. So, and trust me, and I mean this very sincerely, when I left education, I actually thought that I wouldn't be having this conversation 30 odd years later. So without organisations such as Stonewall, without actually doing training, things don't change. So what I would really like to express is that we think the next generation will have mastered it. We think we think our bosses of the future will have nailed this conversation, but they won't. They need the support, they need the training. We need to keep ourselves up to date about how to keep ourselves safe. So I think that's my key takeaway from just as the top line, is that this is a work in progress. and it doesn't happen without effort. So I think it's great that everybody's attending, but we really need to push forward together.
Thank you. And I think as we move through the conversation, we can definitely tap more into this idea of what action looks like in terms of being able to elicit that change. Mo, what were your thoughts?
So I think the reason that we're all here today is that what connects us is that we are all at work. This is a workplace conversation. And I always remember back learning about physics at school that energy is finite. And if we are spending some of it hiding who we are, then that means that our workplaces necessarily will be unable to get access to our full capabilities. If we don't have, if we think about 38% of bi people being unable to be themselves at work, that means that for those people, they are spending some of the energy that they might have been able to spend on creativity or continuing whatever it is that you do in your workplaces, making sure that they don't reveal their true selves. And so what a waste for that individual and that workplace is the key thing I think about. The other two things I thought I might reflect is just how kind of those concepts of intersectionality translate into some of those statistics there. So if we see the statistic in relation to employees with disabilities not feeling able to be out at work, and that adds to kind of this the importance of recognizing there is no one LGBT story, that actually we across every single aspect of identity there have always been LGBT people. So it's about ensuring that we don't create a culture that makes assumptions about who people are that might then create additional barriers to bringing whole self to work. And the last thought was something that was said to me years ago. It was EY actually, in relation to anti-racist workplaces, and it was about thinking about asking yourself the question from the other end of the telescope. So if you are, for example, you've run your data and you've recognized that you're underrepresented in terms of people of color, for example, ask yourself as an organization what it is that you are doing to successfully recruit white people. If we have a situation where you're running the data and we find similar gaps in terms of race, disability, in terms of LGBT identities, ask ourselves, what is it as workplaces about our advertising, our admissions application processes, social cultures, our ways of progression that are working for people outside of those characteristics, and then turn the telescope round. So I think we all know how to do some things well. It's about learning from what we're already doing and adapting it to an LGBT inclusive setting.
Thank you, Mo. I love that idea of spinning things on its head to look for the solution and changing ways of thinking. It's great. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into our first poll, and this is where you all as participants get to do some work, which is very exciting. So this is the question: how confident would you feel having a conversation with a colleague about their mental health? This is any colleague, so we're not talking specifically at this point around LGBT plus colleagues. This is having a conversation around mental health generally. So you've got very confident, somewhat confident, neutral, somewhat unconfident, and very unconfident. So what I'd like to do is choose your vote, and then we'll see the results. How are we doing, Alex? Have we got any results that we can share? Okay, so in terms of confidence, so it looks like the kind of very confident, somewhat confident, that seems to be pretty high, and neutral and somewhat unconfident, and nobody says that they're very unconfident. So there's a real indicator that whilst we might not all be in the very confident space, there is some confidence in having these conversations, which is great. Wonderful. So I'm going to move you on to the second poll, which is how confident would you feel that you could have a conversation with a colleague about their mental health in an LGBT plus inclusive way? So thinking specifically through the lens of LGBT plus people. I want you to think about how confident you would feel having a conversation with a colleague about their mental health. Again, very confident, somewhat confident, neutral, somewhat unconfident, very unconfident. So again, choose your percentage, your rating, and then we will see what the percentages are. Okay, so in terms of very confident, so we've still got a small group of people in the very confident space. 55% somewhat confident, and then we've definitely got an increase in percentages as we move into neutral and somewhat unconfident and very unconfident. So thank you everybody for participating in that and for helping us to see kind of how you're feeling about these conversations. I'm really interested to know from the panel, reflecting on those results, what do you think stops people from feeling confident when they're looking through the lens of being LGBT plus inclusive around these conversations? And what have you experienced in the past that's been positive that you could share to reinforce people to try different ways of having these conversations? So I'm going to come to Pippa. What are your thoughts?
So my immediate thoughts are, I think, really speaking to people who are maybe less confident, is that it's always difficult facing, even having your own discussion about mental health within your own head is number one, is also a starting point. So when you get to the point where you do want to reach out to a colleague, is to really make sure that even if you work for a small organisation, that to empower the person that you are confiding in, to really make sure that you yourself are aware that there might be other organisations who can offer help and support. Because I think with mental health, because in my view, it's obviously not a new thing, but it's a new thing for the workplace to discuss it. I think it's having the tools to empower yourself to be practical about finding resolution. So I think it's really, don't start a conversation feeling like, feeling like there is no solution. There are support systems. And I know when you're foundering that it's always very difficult to do that sort of logical thought processes. But I think if you can make yourself aware, not just for you, but for your colleagues, I know we've already talked about allyship, but to really make sure that you understand that the conversation is supported, and you are definitely not the first person, or people around you are not the first person to be experiencing any mental health. And in the view, particularly in the view, to answer your question, Emma, about LGBT, is that it's really just to come from the viewpoint. I think I was going to mention this maybe slightly later, but your manager or your colleagues, they want to help you. So they won't perceive your orientation, or they shouldn't perceive your orientation as anything other than just a part of your intersectional way of being, like any other part of you. Whether you're good at the numbers or whether you're good at the writing, it's really much about to be perceived as very much on equal par with that. It is just a part of you.
Thank you, Pippa. I love what you're describing in terms of those pathways and support, kind of next steps that you could take that are very specific to what people need, and being able to empower people to find the solutions that they need and go to the right places. I think that's such an important point. Mo, what are your thoughts?
So I think it's important to break this down, isn't it, about thinking what are the hallmarks of a quality conversation around mental health. So one of the first things is ensuring that it is a boundaried conversation, that we understand our role within the workplace, where our responsibilities lie to supporting our teammates' positive mental health, and where they end, and where it is the right time to ensure that there is the specialist support, depending on the size of your workplace, whether this is through your HR teams or whether it's about support to external agencies. And particularly ensuring that the support agencies that you use, so your employee assistance programs, if you have one, or the free support services, and I know you'll be getting more resources on those at the end of this talk, include LGBT inclusive organisations. The second thing, I think the most important step in being LGBT inclusive is not being heteronormative or cisnormative. So it is not making assumptions about who is or who is not LGBT. Some people are and are not out, and some people, you are making assumptions that are incorrect based on possible gender stereotypes. So it's starting every conversation in an LGBT inclusive way. So that's being mindful of not projecting your own identities onto the person that you're sharing the conversation with, not making assumptions about partners or lifestyle in kind of conversations that are being used to build trust. So it's being clear on boundaries, being clear on assumptions, and then being educated on the right way of having conversations if the person is talking to you about their mental health and who they are, in a way that you don't feel equipped to respond with the right terminology. Ensure that you have the right language, if you like, and we have terminology exercises that support people to ensure that the conversation is being had in language that is inclusive.
Thank you, Mo. And Matt, what were your thoughts?
Actually, to build on what Mo just said, I think it's a really positive thing that over the last few months, we've actually started rolling out the use of pronouns in our signatures. It might seem as a very small thing, but in the workplace and the day-to-day, I think I was having this conversation the other day about making the use of pronouns more visible, but also more day-to-day and normal. I think going back to the cis-normative and the heteronormative ways that quite a lot of workplaces are still kind of structured, it's important to recognise that you shouldn't assume someone's gender identity or their sexuality. And just a little nod like that is really helpful. And even if it's just something that you as a personal, in your personal signature at work, it doesn't have to be a company-wide thing that you can do. It does show and signal whenever you might be emailing someone that there is that kind of level of understanding. And that actually moves on to something as a positive experience that I can share. So as part of my remit in one of our employee resource groups at my agency, we send regular communications around important events in the LGBT+ calendar, for example. And one of them was Celebrate Bisexuality Week, which is around Bisexual Awareness Day. And when I shared that piece of communication out, it was full of resources, so always educational, and making sure that anything that you put out or any conversations that you might want to start with your colleagues or your workplace is always educational and to help people find out more if they are willing to and want to. But it also instilled the confidence for 2 colleagues that I wasn't previously aware of to actually come out to me. And I think that in that kind of very opposite end of the spectrum, it shows that when you do something as small as putting a piece of comms out, that those conversations that you might not expect to happen at work, it doesn't mean that we're going to force them to, but it just shows that there is that ability to have that openness in a working environment. Thank
you, Matt. I love that example of how you can do something and have such immense impact, and by creating trust and creating a space for people to be authentic about their identity. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, we're going to move on to our final poll. So we know that the last 9 months have been focused all around COVID-19, quite rightly, and it will have had an impact on people in lots of different ways. And Mo's talked about intersectionality, the intersections and how we're impacted in different ways. So thinking about the pandemic specifically, I'd like you to consider how aware you are of the potential impacts of the pandemic experienced specifically by LGBT plus colleagues. And for some of you, this might be very personal. So again, just, think about your reflections here. So very aware, somewhat aware, I'm not sure, or I have no idea. So just take a minute, share your thoughts, and then we'll look at the results. Okay, so we've got a bit of a mixed bag, but it looks like there's, in terms of numbers, we've got some people that are very aware, somewhat aware. There's a number of you that aren't sure or have no idea. So thank you for sharing those reflections. I'm going to go to the panel, and I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are around the impact of the pandemic and what things people perhaps could be doing to raise their awareness if they're not sure, or they don't have an idea of the impact. So Matt, can I come to you?
Of course you can. Yeah, I think it would be an understatement to say that the pandemic has had a little impact on everyone's lives, whatever your background is. But in a specific LGBT plus context, I think quite a lot of, so speaking from personal experience, a lot of friends and colleagues that I know have found it quite difficult just in a general mental health context, but more specifically for LGBT plus. Some have had to relocate away from where they normally would live, back into households, for example, that might not be as inclusive as they're used to on a day-to-day. So having to return, in some instances, back to a family home where conversations might not be as open, or if at all open. And I think that is one of the probably one of the more known about issues out there at the moment, where people have had to isolate in those situations. But for others, it might not be that they're isolating at home in a necessarily closed environment, but the actual socializing impact of that as well. So being able to mix with a chosen family, for example, or a community outside of work, but outside of your home, it's outside of your flat, for example, but not being able to mix with them anymore, and because of physical social distancing, is again quite taking its toll on a few people's mental health. In terms of raising awareness for it, one of the actual campaigns that I was lucky enough to work on, as an example, was Skittles Pride early this year. I've actually worked on it for the last 3 years. And with them as a brand, so Mars as a company, they've been supporting Switchboard, which is an LGBT plus helpline in the UK for the past number of years. And before the pandemic was a thing, we were already talking about how we can more authentically and more robustly support the actual messaging and support that Switchboard can give. And the oncoming storm that was COVID kind of alerted us that we needed to do even more to support that. And so one of our campaigns was the ability to send people letters in the post for free, called Letters with Pride, and just re-establishing that contact between people that had been lost because of the pandemic. It could be that they're just not feeling themselves, and imagine seeing that in the post. It was very colourful letter, and working with Gay Times and Switchboard to be able to put that out there, as well as general support and communication across social media, particularly for the younger generations, but all generations that are affected by this, about where they can go for support, so switchboard and safe space. Because yeah, with the physical and social distancing aspect that's now been brought on, it's really important to keep on top of that as much as possible, or know where the support is if you need it.
And how did that campaign go, Matt?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember how many, but there were many in the thousands of letters that were sent. Unfortunately, I was going to share the link, but that's now the website's been taken down now, so the campaign's over. But it performed really well, and it was just a continuation of a lot of the comms that we put out as an LGBT plus inclusive and mental health aware brand, such as Skittles, to get that conversation and support going.
Great, thank you, Matt. Pippa,
No worries.
what are your thoughts?
Like everybody, I don't think anybody can underestimate the impact of the pandemic. But through the lens of the LGBT community, something which I really notice is that it's very easy to park subjects like your sexual orientation. And because you're relentlessly being told that there's such a bigger problem, it's such a bigger issue, there's employment, there's people getting food on their tables. But the reality is that if you don't look after your whole self, so if your whole self includes you being part of the LGBT community, do not underestimate that you must, as Matt says, as Mo's already said, is to look after each other, but also look after yourself. Do not park your sexual orientation. Do make sure that you stay close to your chosen family, and that chosen family may be your blood family, or it may be your friendship group. And also just to really make sure that, that you do, I know I mean, I'm sure all of us are madly connecting, not just through the visual, the VC of Zooms, but on the WhatsApps. But don't be ashamed just to say, is everybody okay? And maybe do literally a round robin, because quite often people just get quieter and quieter and quieter. It's very easy in this urban virtual lives of ours to forget each other. But to literally do a quick round robin saying, please check in, and then maybe follow up to those 1 or 2 individuals within your friendship group who don't respond, because sometimes not responding means that they are suffering in silence. And it's a nice way of communicating. And also it gives you the opportunity just to maybe have some private one-to-one chats, which is also such a wonderful thing to do in this present environment.
And is there anything from a workplace perspective, Pippa, that you would say around connectivity that has worked well from your perspective, thinking about LGBT plus colleagues?
So I'm proud of our own ERG, actually. I'm really proud of it. We've sort of stepped away from the more, what I would call the more regular workplace way of communicating, which is discussing potential panel events, keeping it very formal. The newsletter now includes quite an interactive entertainment guide. It's kind of actually allowed us to tone down the professional side of our identities, and actually, and in fact, I think I've watched more bi movies, and I've watched, so there are joyous things to have come out of this. And I actually, so from a workplace, it sounds like I'm stepping away from the workplace, but I feel like as our workplace is now our home place, the merging of lines is very blurred. So I actually think to really pursue that, but I think that my overall comment is not to think that your sexuality, your orientation, your way of presenting becomes lesser than, because it doesn't.
Great, thank you, Pippa. Mo?
I was nodding so much then to everything you were saying, Pippa, that actually I was kind of glad I wasn't on screen. Yeah, so to just echo so much of what Matt and Pippa have said. I mean, obviously this is truly unprecedented, and it's not only understanding the impact of COVID in every aspect of our life. It's also the greatest intervention in our personal lives of the state that any of us have experienced, and at a time when there's genuine uncertainty in the job market. So our relationship with our employers might be stretched in a different way at the moment, when our employers cannot say with confidence what the future looks like, which is something that I think is a conflict we really need to hold consciously in looking at our responses to supporting positive mental health across our organisations and in our direct colleague relationships. I mean, I think Matt was really right about, if we think back to some of the findings from that Queer Futures research, and the contributing factor to poorer mental health outcomes of being partially out in different spheres in your life, and juggling that, and that moving, with restrictions in where we can live, who we can live with, what it means for our chosen families. I think it is no surprise that it is hitting, COVID is hitting our LGBT communities hard. And the LGBT Foundation survey that I think you're including in your resources, are you, Emma? I think will be, again, another resource for those on the call to ensure that they are appropriately aware of actually what some of those impacts mean directly in terms of things like access to healthcare and access to medication. But in terms of pointing to a positive, so if we look at what is if you like, the responses to the factors within minority stress theory, the key mitigators are creating conditions for self-expression, and also creating conditions for acceptance of family, friends, and colleagues as allies. So if we look at that self-expression, it's ensuring, but obviously this would depend on the size workplace that you work within, but it's ensuring that if you had an LGBT network or Pride network before, that actually enough, if not more, attention is being given than before to ensuring it's got the conditions to thrive digitally, and ensuring that the voices of the LGBT people in your workplace, whether out or not, are being heard at that leadership table, so that needs are being understood and action can be taken. To go back to Pippa's point, it can be that inclusion becomes the free range eggs, when people are trying to economize on their shopping list. It is not an optional extra for many of us. It's not something that is a nice to have when we've finished with the health and safety. Reinventing our workplaces give us a chance to look at what it means to all bring our whole self to work, and it's really important that leadership conversation is kept up, and that goes back to where Pippa started actually, which is looking at how much has changed and how much hasn't changed about LGBT inclusion in the workplace and in wider society, and investing in the right action. And as a small organisation, if that's just ensuring that you've accessed some of the free resources from the likes of Stonewall and others, or if you're slightly larger, looking at training in some workplace-wide schemes to ensure that there is a strategic approach to ensuring that you fully understand who is in your workforce, who is not, and what everybody needs to do to ensure that we all have the conditions to thrive.
Thank you, Mo. I feel like that finished on a perfect end to our discussion with all of our questions, so thank you. We're going to move into a Q&A now, so now's an opportunity for those of you who've been watching. I know that there's some questions that will have been coming in, but anything that you'd like to ask our panel, please pop a question in, and we will work our way through them.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, thank you to everyone who's been sending in questions so far. We've got a number that we will try and kick off with, but please do send in any more that you have. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can. We can't promise that we will get through all of them, but what we always do is try to follow up with you afterwards if we don't get around to it during the session. So we'll start with a question from Elliot, who says, I work for a small company of 175 people, and I'm the only openly gay person, and as a member of the HR team, I want to promote a safe environment for people to bring their whole selves to work, but without shouting into the void. Are there things I can try to get the ball rolling softly, particularly in a remote environment?
Great question. Thank you, Elliot. Pippa, what do you think?
Well, 175 people, so thank you for your question, Elliot. But 175 people isn't so small, and you being the only out person, the stats don't add up there. There must be other people who are either wanting to come out or, so you've got a huge role to play, Elliot. It's not all on your own shoulders, but I appreciate you're wearing a hat with two, you're in the HR. is I would definitely make sure, if budgets allowed, that your senior management at board level were getting some really proper roots up involvement and training to make sure that, to try and make sure that they understand that having an LGBT community within their organisation which is comfortably out is a huge selling point for their company. It's such a good benchmark that if you accept and nurture and accommodate your LGBT community and you look after them and you look after their mental health, you demonstrate to the outside world that it's a very good company, full stop. Their bottom line's going to be better, it's a given. So to really reach out, just to try and build a relationship with confidence with your senior management as a plus positive way of including your LGBT community, and make that conversation very two-way. Then, as you say, I'm not shouting at you, I'm not hounding at you, I'm not trying to sell you something that you don't need. The companies need this, and 175 people is a nice sized company to be able to really bring some genuine change.
Thank you. Mo and Matt, is there anything that you would add to that?
So I think that was a really clear answer. It's absolutely about making the business case as well as the moral case, and it is important about starting with data. So excuse me, to go back to my point earlier, ensuring that that right through the employee life cycle that the data is being collected to understand applicants, to understand excuse me, to understand who's applying, who's succeeding interview, who's progressing through the organisation, and to look at the satisfaction levels from the staff survey, and then where you see gaps against kind of the rest of society, then you need to ask your organisation, why is it that they're confident, that why is it that they're happy drawing their talent from a reduced pool? Because ultimately that is the consequence of non-inclusive workplaces.
Thank you. Go, Matt.
Yeah, no, I was just going to echo exactly what Pippa and Mo had actually said. I think, yeah, 175 is a wonderful size to be working with, and it's, if you're able and in a position to be able to make sure that you can make those changes within the recruitment process, because I think even with a company, as using mine as an example, it's a lot bigger than 175, but what they had done in the recruitment process is to make sure that they are recruiting from areas where it is where historically they've been on numbers, so from the Black and ethnic minority communities, from LGBT plus, for example, disability, etc., making sure that you're working from the bottom up and having it clear and open with everyone that might be looking to join your company or ideally staying at your company is key. So yeah, definitely what Mo and Pippa have already commented on.
Thank you. Alex, next question, please.
Thank you all. I'm aware that Sunit and Lisa have asked similar questions about kind of starting those conversations within their organizations. So setting up an LGBT employee network, and how do we start having those conversations and making sure those are being supported. I hope some of that the panel have just offered has helped answer that question, those questions for you. We have a question on how do we address, from Lily, who asks, how do we address non-inclusive or discriminatory colleagues, for example, those who refuse to accept non-binary identities or might be against homosexuality?
Matt, you're off mute, so I'm gonna jump on you and ask you what you think in response to that question.
I think it's a very delicate situation to handle, but I think with clear signposting to resources and with a detailed sort of response to those who might be using non-inclusive and discriminatory terms is key. As I mentioned before, sharing resources, education in any kind of context, it's never too late to learn about anything. and it's important that if there is that kind of scenario presents itself, just making sure that you share that information with them. At the end of the day, it is up to that individual or those individuals if they want to receive that information and take it on board. And if it does, speaking from my level of the company, which is relatively low, if that then does present itself, it's about you knowing where to go within your company if a problem does arise. So knowing to go to your people department or HR department or any resources, internal or external, that you can head towards.
Pippa and Mo, is there anything that you would add to that?
I'd like to just maybe add with, it is always delicate, that I'm not underestimating that, but when discrimination enters the workplace, and if you are the recipient of being discriminated against, it is wrong as opposed to right. It is, in a lot of cases, it's against the law. You need to make sure that you gather your thoughts, go to your HR department, even if it's a very small company, but remember you have right on your side. Bullying is not acceptable in the workplace. Your own safeties, your own confidences, if they are being harmed, damaged or anything, it is the company's responsibility to look after you. Even in small companies should be able to reach out to outside resources to get support. Do not think that you putting up with poor behaviour is something that you just have to put up with somebody who's more senior, more older, and has more authority than you. You really do need to try and pluck up the courage to do the right thing. The right thing is to report it. And if you need to reach out to a colleague, which is exactly what the whole of this, your mental health can be damaged. Don't allow yourself to be hurt. Reach out to a colleague, ask them to hold your hand, and try and pluck up the courage to take it forward. We do need to make sure that our workplaces are safe.
Yes, absolutely agree with that, Pippa, in terms of ensuring that it is clear to everyone, the Equality Act, and that the organisation's policy on equity, diversity, inclusion are clear. But what, to slightly corrupt the metaphor, culture eats policy for breakfast, and it is about having that conversation with the HR and the leadership team about actually what they are doing to support inclusive practice, which includes having accessible processes for informal and formal grievances where discriminatory behaviour is happening, because actually some of what's described in that question is discriminatory behaviour, and organisations need to be very clear about which behaviours are encouraged and which have no place in the workplace, for exactly the protective reasons that Pippa has outlined. So it is about ensuring that the right training induction is there for the staff relevant to the size of the organisation, that the policy is clear, that the support is there through the HR, and that the leadership is role modelling the right culture to give the infrastructure for all of that, and ensuring that the training, again, scaled to the right size of organisation, is in place to make all of that come alive so that everyone is respected at work.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you all. A related question to that one, but I wonder whether if we use a specific example, it might be useful to touch on that. It's a question on, if I overhear my colleagues making transphobic comments, should I confront them or should I take it to HR?
Mo, can I come to you and get your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question, because it's about allyship 24/7, isn't it? It's about ensuring that we don't only respect pronouns and challenge discriminatory practice when someone who shares the identity that's being discriminated against is in the room. It is important that you risk assess the implications for yourself in that situation, and ensure that you then make that decision about how far it is challenged constructively immediately in that setting, or whether you need to pursue an HR route to address. So it will depend on the level of risk to yourself within it. The important thing is that it is not let go, that it is challenged at that time, so that it can either be learned from or stopped, and ideally both.
Thank
Also,
you.
if I could just jump in there, just to remind people that, and maybe for the larger organisations, but quite often HR do have access, and your HR teams are also trained in this, that there is an HR will not immediately fire somebody. They will go through an informal process, and they will try and sort of gauge the gravitas of the situation and then take the right road. So going to your HR is not sort of, it's not landing somebody in it. I think there's a fear of ratting on somebody. Bad behaviour is bad behaviour. You're not ratting on somebody, you're just facilitating the organisation to do the right thing.
It almost ties into that idea of cancel culture, doesn't it? And this idea that if you say one thing, and there will be different parameters for the things that people say and share in terms of discriminatory comments, but the idea of, encouraging people to learn and to change behaviour, I think, is really important as well, based on what you've just shared. Matt, is there anything else that you would add?
No, actually, it's perfectly summed up by both Pippa and Mo.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Alex, next question.
Thank you all again. We've had a question from one of our MHF England instructor members, which is great to see. Claire asked, when delivering future courses, how can we as instructors ensure this topic is raised and discussed without it just being statistics? I work a lot with construction companies who find this as a difficult topic to cover. So I guess a question on, if we are teaching mental health, how can we make sure it's inclusive, particularly for sectors who may not be as receptive?
Great, thank you, Claire. Pippa, what are your reflections?
The banking community is a very male dominated, and a culture which is quite prone to saying, I'm far too busy to discuss much more important and busy things. So I totally respect the construction companies' view. I don't respect it, but I know it exists. Is to really maybe try and make sure that companies realise that not looking at mental health, not looking at your LGBT community straight in the eye is actually laziness. It's poor, it's just indicative of a company who cannot, and to try and get away that this, oh, I'm construction, we don't have gay people. It's just old school, it's not acceptable, it's lazy, and they need to demonstrate a company. And I appreciate that, when you have a culture which goes hand in hand with construction or banking or a lot of these other industries, it is just, it's difficult to say how to do it practically, but to really try and say that, to try and talk about mental health as important as good old-fashioned training. Training in all aspects of work, whether it's about putting up scaffolding safely or talking to your colleagues in a safe way. I think it really just goes back to the idea that it's become, we are entering into an era where it's lazy not to look at these things. And I think if you're lazy with your D&I, then I think it will show that there's probably other aspects in your company that you're not excelling at, and we all need to excel in all parts.
Thank you, Pippa. Matt and Mo, is there anything that you would add in terms of how you bring these topics within the context of mental health, how you bring it to life outside of numbers?
I'm happy to go next. So I think it's about bringing it back to humanity and understanding, encouraging people to reflect on their own lives and their identities and how that has contributed to their own past and previous mental health experiences, and sharing some of the resources that we've been talking about today. I think in order to, effective conversations are based, if you like, on effective questioning. So it's ensuring that as colleagues and leaders and workplaces, we've asked ourselves the right questions to ensure that we are approaching all of our people supporting initiatives, including mental health ones, from the perspective of everybody who works with us. So it is about, if you like, doing that privilege walk of looking at the signals that we're sending about our cultures, from our policies to our working environments to the way that we talk about ourselves, ourselves and seeing and how far, and asking ourselves, and how far would I see myself reflected in my workplace if I was somebody else, and thinking through the different identities to build empathy, to build understanding, and to build an appetite for educating ourselves so that we're better equipped to remove some of those assumptions and barriers that can be barriers that can stifle those quality mental health conversations. On the example of construction, we do have a number of large construction organisations that are Stonewall Diversity Champion organisations who who are working hard to improve their LGBT inclusivity, and we also do some empowerment leadership, LGBT and allies leadership programs with a number of construction organisations. So I guess it's about asking those you work with, depending on what's appropriate for their scale, what is it that they're doing to ensure that they've seen their whole workforce as their whole selves.
Thank you. Matt,
And I think,
anything?
yeah, I think contextualization is hugely key, whether if it's put in a humanity context, just people talking to people in a training session, or if it's in that work context, as Mo mentioned, and this is true for almost any industry out there. There is bound to be at least one example of a company within its vertical industry that has had experience or is tackling similar issues or raising awareness of these issues. So in the same way that we're talking about raising issues or concerns from a personal context, it's also important to recognize that you're probably not alone as a company in sorting out these kinds of issues or addressing these topics. And the Stonewall Diversity Champions list, as Mo obviously mentioned, is a good place to start for a lot of the large companies, and just taking examples from that, no matter what size your own company is.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you all. We've had a message from another MHFA England instructor member, Kevin Gardner, who says who's offered to chat with Claire offline, as he's a fellow instructor who's LGBT+ and was happy to discuss lived experience. So if you guys want to connect on LinkedIn, that would be great. We've had a question regarding, I've lost it now. Bear with me. So it's a sort of hypothetical situation, or it may even be a real situation. My colleague is having a difficult time going through a period of discovery with their own sexuality. How can I best help them as a fellow employee?
Great question, thank you. Matt, I'm going to come to you first.
I think first and foremost, being there in whatever kind of shape or form as a person they can talk to, just making sure that you are that your colleague is aware that if there's any concern that they might have or they want to, they could come to you, and be open and honest about that. There probably will be a topic that you might not feel comfortable with, and I think as much as it is about them, that person finding themselves and discovering themselves and more about their identity, it's about from that, purely looking from a selfish point of view, if you want to, it's about learning about who you are as well and what you are able to talk about. And as much of a journey it is for them, it is also for you to understand what you can learn by being someone that is an ally in their journey, if they're at the beginning of it. I think, as I mentioned in that work context, so earlier on, the two people that came out to me over email, I've been there as a supporting figure. In that specific instance, they came out as bisexual to me, and I'm one of the few people that they know that is also bisexual, so there is that kind of shared experience. So in some scenarios you might have that privilege or benefit from that. Being having your door always open, which sounds like a redundant kind of phrase now, given we're all working from home at the moment, but yeah.
Thank you, Matt. Pippa, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, first of all, if this colleague has already made it clear that that they're on this journey and that you're aware of it, I would congratulate yourself for obviously being open to that. It's exactly what we're talking about: caring for each other, looking after each other. If they haven't approached you about the conversation, I mean, just easy old-fashioned, you know, tactics of talking about that maybe you were out with some other colleagues who are LGBT or bi or whatever other, just generally really, you know, I know it seems crazy or anything, but just to drop it into the conversation that it's a part of your life. If different ways of being is a part of your life, whether that's cultural orientation, is, you know, just to really make sure that they realise that that is a conversation that you are very comfortable to have in the workplace, that you don't, that those conversations where you don't leave being a mum at home, you don't leave being a, you know, you don't leave any part of you at home, whether that's in, you know, in this new world, or it's just to really have those conversations and make it clear that you're, and also that if they are on a journey and it's an unknown outcome, there's no expectation of anyone to, you know, question their identity, whether that is, you know, anything from gender change to, you know, questioning of anything, whether it's, you know, sexual orientation. It's not a finite. It's a very fluid world we live in, and we respect people in that world. And I think, again, it's just introducing language into your everyday conversations is what I would recommend.
Any final thoughts from you, Mo?
No, just to echo what Matt and Pippa have said, really, it's, you know, to at risk of invoking George Michael, it's to listen without prejudice, isn't it? That's the primary task. Had to get George in somewhere. It is about recognizing that the person is an expert in their own experience and resisting the temptation to move into solving. So it is more about listening, being there, making yourself aware of what other support is available should the person that you're listening to want that signposting, and just making sure you're aware of what workplace networks might exist, and just signaling that your support for them as their whole self, because that's the most valuable thing, that nothing changes about your relationship despite their changing relationship with their self. So I think that is the most supportive thing to do.
Thank you, Mo.
With 1 minute remaining, I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you to everyone who has sent in their questions. I hope the ones we answered, they were really useful. So the ones we didn't, I'm really sorry. We always get inundated with questions, but they're all really useful, and we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards over email. And a reminder that a number of the resources, or all of the resources that we've mentioned today will be included in the follow-up as part of the email, but I will leave Emma to round us off.
It's just to say thank you for spending the last hour and 15 minutes with us to explore this topic. Thank you to the brilliant panelists, Mo, Matthew, to Pippa, for sharing your insights, your experiences, and your honest stories. And to just wish everyone to have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope that you're able to take some of what we've covered today and put it into action as soon as possible. So thank you very much and enjoy your Thursday.